Hi, everybody. I'm very glad for participating in this summit. My name is Rositsa Bratkova. I'm an architect, a practitioner mostly, but I'm also teaching at the Sofia Architectural University. And my current interest is in the principles of the architecture of Sir David Chipperfield and the Metamodern features that he seems to reveal. Metamodernism and postmodernism are specific in architecture, so I shall begin with some popular images of the modern movement and of the postmodern one. Architectural form shows constancy in time, so a hard task for modern architects was to abandon traditional forms and invent new ones uncontaminated with historicity. However, the rigidity of these new forms was not easily accepted by the general public. In search for a more comprehensible architectural language, postmodernism turned to the entire repertoire of historical forms, but its detached irony proved inappropriate. Therefore, postmodernism was short-lived, and already in the 90s, something different was going on in architecture. If postmodern architecture was made for architects, then it was followed by a revised and sincere involvement in solving real problems. This new architecture uses rather modernist language, but is more sensitive. It respects history without mocking. It is less formal and more atmospheric. It very often incorporates the idea of passing of time in its buildings. This new architecture we can call metamodern. When in 1994, Charles Jencks declared the death of modern architecture, it was clear to many, though obviously not to him, that postmodern architecture was already dead. That same year were announced the results from the international competition for the reconstruction of the Neues Museum in Berlin. The new classical building from 1859, designed by Schindler's student Stüler, was left to decay after the bombardment in World War II. The winning entry by Giorgio Grassi was 100% postmodern, but for various reasons, and luckily, it was not built. David Chipperfield was appointed second with the proposal for reconstruction of the original staircase and with a delicate new wing. The lightness of the facade seems quite modern, but it has a shifting focus towards materiality and light as a sensual experience. The way light penetrates the matte glazing of the outer facade and the translucent alabaster inner layer is very different from the sharp, direct light in modernist buildings. Furthermore, Chipperfield alludes the horizontal division of his design to Greek temple, as such was the original reference for Friedrich Stüler back in the 19th century. Though such a referentiality is clearly postmodern, there is not a trace from the ironic detachment with which the first prize Giorgio Grassi refers to the symmetry and massiveness of the Neues Museum. In a second competition in 1997, David Chipperfield was assigned the reconstruction of the Neues, which lasted for 12 years. Enchanted by the ruin, but without stressing on its decay, Chipperfield, in a romanticist manner, reveals both the endurability and the fragility of the ruin and the beauty he found there. Due to the World War II devastation, some of the original parts look older than they really are, as if the passing of time has been intensified upon them. Chipperfield's archaeological approach preserves the various traces of time, of the initial state, the existence as a ruin, and the reconstructed parts. All of them form a new whole. This multitude of parts is radically different from the postmodern idea of the collage. As the collage is flat and its pieces are detached from their origin, in Chipperfield's Neues Museum, each part remains connected to its original time, and all of them together remain readable while forming a new entity. There is a constant oscillation between the parts and the whole, and therefore between the various times in the building. For the new parts, Chipperfield used more than 1,030,000 old bricks gathered from across Europe. Along with the partly exposed original bricks, they were left uncovered. That change from the initial adorned stone-like appearance revealed the hidden fragility of the building. The old-new basic materiality seems soft and unfinished, as in archaeology raw gypsum is used for binding together the pieces of an object. The new parts are further scumbled so that their freshness is dimmed to that of the old ones. There is neither contrast between old and new, nor imitation in that approach. In fact, at that time, it was an unconventional way of working with a historical building. The strong sensitivity of a skilled craftsman who is aware of the dignity of his work, but also not devoid of modesty, is to be seen everywhere. Sometimes the new plaster is scratched so as to dim the contrast to the old one. In the course of 3 years, 30,000 clay pots were handmade by a single man for the repair of some of the domes. Throughout the reconstruction, the manual skills were used along with the utmost technology. What we see here is a new commitment, a new attitude to architecture that seems to be metamodern. Shortly after the Noise Museum came the commission for the James Simon Gallery, which serves as the new entrance to the museum scenery. Its monolithic base and its slender colonnade doubtlessly refer to classical architecture and its revival that inspired the initial design of the museum's island. The gallery takes from the concept of the Altes Museum by Schinkel, whose elongated front facade reinterprets the side facade of a Doric temple. Chipperfield interpreted the classical Greek with modernist tools in the way Schinkel did it in his 19th century neoclassical language. Following Schinkel's romanticist love for contrasting proportions, Chipperfield's building is extremely elongated, but unlike the Altes, it is accessed from its short side. Each of the two elongated parts is further longitudinally divided into two. Thus, due to the extreme proportions of the colonnaded spaces, the building attains the character of promenade passages. On the ground level, the James Simon is connected to the so-called colonnaden, which Chipperfield continued so that they fully enclose the Noise Museum. He made his own contemporary interpretation of that new classical element and turned it into the main component of the new gallery. Regarded in that relation, along with its proportions, the James Simon could be perceived not only as a reference to classical temple, but also as a spatial note of the new colonnades. The building has several entrances. Beside the grand stair, there are other entrances on the ground level, and the entire building acts as a porous filter where one could go in at various places and cross it before needing a ticket. On the western facade, another stair is carved that goes down the Spree River. Halfway down, one can cross a narrow passage between the Pergamon and James Simon and reach the square in front of the Noise. That closes an entire loop around the building and adds yet another dimension to its connectedness and the ways one could experience it. Here, experiencing the building has gained importance over the act of entering it. Though it sounds naive, Chipperfield's museums are designed for the people, equally for the general public as for the actual museum visitors. They are democratic as their architectural experience is free and denied to no one. They are devoid of both the modern and postmodern elitist posture, but have their different metamodern constrained generosity. Chipperfield's buildings are solid and heavy and have the presence of vast physical objects, which they actually are. Though assembled from parts, their form is always complete and pure, never arbitrary or clustered. As a rule, the material palette is constrained and color has only a subdued position, so that the physical qualities of the materials are revealed to their fullest. Chipperfield's favorite material is concrete, with some local aggregate in it. For instance, the whiteness of the columns in the James Simon and that of the staircase in the Noise is achieved thanks to the Saxon marble chips added to the concrete. So, into the basic, unpretentious modern material, a precious one was infused that elevated it above the ordinary, romanticizing it. However massive the material may be, the boundary is always permeable and the whole building is both solid and porous. Again, there is no opposition, but rather a constant oscillation between the various modes of perceiving the building, as heavy, solid, and monolithic, yet as light, permeable, and assembled. Modern architecture is often accused for its arrogance towards context. Despite its promoted endeavors, postmodernism managed no better. With its restored affect and regained sensitivity to the spirit of a place and its atmosphere, metamodern architecture is deeply contextual. At first sight, the architectural image of the Jumex Museum in Mexico City is radically different from its surrounding buildings, each with their own identity. Clad in local travertine, Chipperfield's work oscillates between two modes of reading. On the one hand, it is a strictly modernist functional machine. The elevation upon columns is one of the 5 modernist principles Le Corbusier postulated. The sawtooth roof facilitates the skylight preferred in museum spaces. For that same reason, the upper floor gallery is windowless. Openings appear only in the lower floors where the public events take place. The columns seem short as they are partly covered by the skirt of the building, which is necessary for framing the view. The whole building seems to be a sheer expression of functionality. The other mode of reading shifts to the exaggerated sharpness of the roof, the massive head upon a small body with disproportionate short legs, all that referred to the indigenous sculptural traditions of Mexico. Yet the building is not a sculpture, nor is it an imitation. There is neither irony nor pastiche in that work. It is connected to Mexican culture, but at the same time it is distanced from its immediate surroundings. In the same manner, the James Simon Gallery refers to the Greek inspiration for German Romanticism of the 19th century with a commitment that withdraws it from its actual here and now. Yet these are real material buildings, flesh and bone, heavy and embedded in their surroundings. The reference far back in time combined with the restrained architectural language make these contemporary buildings look as if they have stood there for centuries. That deliberate displacement and atemporality, though impossible, are again metamodern. In conclusion, I offer you a brief list of metamodern features in the work of Chipperfield, but also in a significant trend of today's architecture. First is a strong interest in the passing of time, which attires more value to older than to new buildings. Therefore, architecture diverts from looking brand new in favor of an air of timelessness, as if it stood there for an indefinite but long period of time. A revived materiality with a preference for natural and heavy materials, ductility, softness, atmosphere. As a consequence, is the avoidance of color in its own right in favor of the material. Rediscovering the virtue of craftsmanship and inserting it into the technological construction process. Democratization of spaces and giving free access to a more general public. Oscillation between contradicting categories, such as solid and porous, light and heavy, open and closed, the whole and the parts, and so on. There is a return of the search for beauty, and with it something elusive and intangible has reappeared in contemporary architecture. It has regained depth. This painting is a 19th century 3D visualization of Sir John Swain's design for the Bank of England. It simultaneously depicts the process of constructing, the finished state, and a Pompeian vision of ruination some 1,000 years ahead. That simultaneous existence of the building in its various times was the initial inspiration for Chipperfield when he started his opus magnum, the Noise Museum. Thank you very much.
Hello everyone, and thank you for being here to listen to my paper in the coming days. Here is my email address. You are very welcome to reach out to me if you have any comments or questions about what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm speaking to you from just outside Umeå and the Umeå School of Architecture in the north of Sweden. We are at 64 degrees north, so for a comparison in the North American context, think of Dawson City in the Yukon. Sweden is one of the larger countries by area in Europe, but it's sparsely populated. The size of California, the population of Rhode Island. Today I want to talk about 2 timber skyscrapers that were completed within a couple of years of each other on opposite sides of the Scandinavian peninsula. At 85 meters tall, Mjøstårnet, designed by Voll Architecture, was finished in 2019 in Brumunddal, and it was the tallest timber building in the world on its completion. The second tallest timber building in the world was completed less than 2 years later, and that's this one, Sara Kulturhus, designed by White Architecture in Skellefteå in the northeast of Sweden. Also a hotel like Mjøstårnet, but with a cultural centre in the lower floors. Mjøstårnet's reign as the world's tallest timber building was very brief. In July 2022, it was eclipsed by the 25-story, 86.6 metre Ascent Tower in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And in 2024, they'll all be eclipsed again by W350, a planned 70-story, 350 metre mass timber skyscraper. So what are these tall timber buildings doing? I want to use these two buildings to propose that we have a new opportunity through them to interrogate the idea of the Danish architect Bjarke Ingels of hedonistic sustainability. Now, this is a concept that Timotheus Vermeulen, our friend and collaborator here at this conference, has speculated about a couple of times in recent years, particularly in the realm of contemporary fashion. So I want to acknowledge his invitation to us to consider it through a metamodern lens. Vermeulen has proposed that Bjarke Ingels' argument for hedonistic sustainability displays a distinctly metamodern attitude towards design,
which sidesteps a typical quantitative conception of what is a sustainable product and emphasizes a more aesthetic and sensuous approach. And Bjarke Ingels would make the argument in this way for the built environment. He's advanced this idea in a couple of TED Talks and public lectures, but also somewhat before that in the 2009 self-published monograph, Yes is More, an archicomic on architectural evolution. And in the opening pages of the book, they visit the canons of modernist and postmodernist architecture, and even President Barack Obama, to sort of synthesize an idea that their approach to architecture is based around this idea that yes is more. Saying yes to everything makes for a better architecture. And Bjarke and Ingels and his colleagues write, historically, the field of architecture has been dominated by two opposing extremes. On the one side, an avant-garde of wild ideas, often so detached from reality that they fail to become something other than eccentric curiosities. On the other side, there are well-organized corporate consultants that build predictable and boring boxes of high standard. Architecture seems entrenched between two equally unfertile fronts, either naively utopian or petrifyingly pragmatic. Rather than choosing one over the other, Big, that's the name of his practice, operates in the fertile overlap between the two opposites, a pragmatic utopian architecture that takes on the creation of socially, economically, and environmentally perfect places as a practical objective. And I think it's in those last words we see a distinctly, or rather clearly, metamodern approach, this idea of this sort of oscillation, this idea of being neither one nor the other, but both at both times. That's not to say that I wouldn't accuse Bjarke Ingels of some fairly reductive design. In the following pages, there's a very explicit description of how they proposed unsuccessfully an upturned Y-shaped skyscraper for Umeå, my adopted hometown in northern Sweden of 120,000 people. It wasn't successful, so they scaled it up by a factor of 3 and then proposed it for Shanghai. A better example maybe to think about how Big articulates this idea of hedonistic sustainability is the Copenhill in Copenhagen in Denmark. This is a waste incineration plant, very common in Scandinavia to burn waste and actually to burn plastic recyclables, because in Scandinavia, the idea of burning plastic is that you're actually recycling it because you're getting energy out of it. And these plants burn waste and then give heat back to the city in the form of district heating systems. So they're very functional buildings, but they're incredibly ugly. And Copenhill is right there in the middle of the city. So Big proposed that because Denmark was flat, mostly flat, and because this would be the tallest building in Copenhagen, it would be a great idea to turn it into a public building that people could access and get to the top of. So the building includes a glazed elevator shaft so that members of the public can go in, and you take this elevator up and see inside the waste incineration plant, you see the machinery that is burning your waste and turning it into heat to warm your apartments. And then when you get to the top, in amongst all these extrusions and these pipes and things, you have a ski slope. And it was a big, sincere hope that within a couple of years of completing this building, Denmark might even become competitive in downhill skiing competitions. Bjarke argues that behavioral change is necessary to achieve meaningful sustainable practices. And in the instance of the Copenhagen, in the original design, there was this notion that the chimney, which pollutes, which gives off CO2 and other airborne emissions, that it would capture the smoke and the steam that builds up over an hour and then release a smoke ring every hour to give the people of Copenhagen like a clock, a regular rhythm that reminds them of what they're doing, and maybe inform them to think about how much waste they're burning and what energy they're getting back. And so there's this idea that buildings are communicating some form of knowledge, some idea, and that they're important because they can help nudge and encourage sustainable behaviors. Right now, there's a growing number of tall timber buildings like this one. This is Sara in Skellefteå in Sweden again. Research published in February 2022 by the Council of Tall Buildings found at least 139 mass timber buildings of 8 stories or higher. So this is a rapidly growing sector of the construction industry, and the interest in these buildings is growing. Krzyżanowska and others write that architectural and aesthetic expression of these buildings, though, is still emergent. That is to say, there's not really a style yet that expresses them. In the same way that the first automobiles look like carriages without horses, so too have many early tall timber buildings mimicked the modes and methods of steel and reinforced concrete buildings. The very first skyscrapers, such as this, the Reliance building in Chicago, which is acknowledged as one of the earliest skyscrapers, simply extruded upwards some fairly traditional forms. So the decoration of this building is made of castings and carvings. It took a while before architects began to speculate about how this new form might take its own shape. Ludwig Nisvanderøe proposed this skyscraper in the 1920s. As early as 1921, he had drawn a skyscraper that looks remarkably prescient. It has a glass curtain wall that hangs, just like most office buildings are built today. And it was later when he got to complete projects in Chicago, notably the apartments in Lakeshore Drive in Chicago, that there was a form emerging that expressed the possibility of a skyscraper, what the skyscraper represented, rather than just mimicking what was done before. The first skyscrapers came obviously from New York and Chicago, and they came out of new technologies. They came out not actually of steel and concrete, but out of the safety elevator that was invented by Elisha Graves Otis. Tall buildings above 10 stories had been feasible before that time, but it wasn't practical to live in a building where you had to climb 10 flights of stairs every day. So really Otis was the inventor, the visionary that made suddenly this building typology take off. And it was in cities like New York, particularly in Manhattan, but also in Chicago, where the scarcity of land and the consequent heightened real estate values fueled a race upwards. And that's why skyscrapers made sense. Skyscrapers are not, they become exponentially more expensive the taller you get. It isn't a straight line graph of increasing costs with height. As you go higher and higher, it gets more and more expensive. That made sense in Manhattan and Chicago. Sorry, a little out of sequence there. The use of structural timber instead of steel and concrete in the way that I'm describing here is currently regarded as one of the most important means of decarbonizing the built environment and demonstrating compliance, in particular with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And for one really high-profile example, in 2020, French Minister Julien de Normandie announced a policy that would require every public building built in France, whether it was a school or a museum or a hospital, should be built at least 50% out of renewable materials, i.e. wood, materials that grow and that can be renewed in that way. And in the academic sphere, there is also an emergent interest in the global connectivity of materials and the energetics of architectural materials. Jane Hutton's book on the left is a fascinating exploration of how materials are connected globally between the far away, far removed environments where they're extracted and mined and where they're used. Keel Mo has made two books, one about the Empire State Building and one about the Seagram Building by Metamodern in New York, which go into granular detail about the material and energetics that have passed through the sites of those two buildings, not just how much the building weighs and where the material comes from, but all of the connections that came from the very first settlement on those lands when they were settled by Europeans who displaced indigenous Americans. So I want to argue in this paper that we should not be trying to understand skyscrapers according to the normal economic arguments for building tall. This is a detail, incidentally, of the Sara Kulturhus in Skellefteå. Like I said, building tall buildings is expensive, and there has to be a financial justification for building them. And what I think is important to state about both Skellefteå in Sweden and Radboud in Norway is that these are very small towns. There is no justification to build tall. There has to be something else going on. In both cases, these buildings have quite expensive premium rate hotels. The Sara Kulturhus also has a cultural center with theater and library and restaurants in it. So when we think about the costs and the meaning of skyscrapers, we should think about those places which have really fueled the development of the form in recent years. Cities like Dubai and Doha, where skyscrapers are very, very clearly not economically rational buildings. There is no restriction on space in these cities, and the justification for building tall is removed from any simple economic rationale. And I think that's obvious. I think everyone, even tourists, who have a stopover in Dubai, recognize this. These tall buildings are being built for status. It is a reasonably certain fact that the majority of office and residential floors of this building, the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, are permanently vacant and have never been rented. But that's not the point. The building isn't there to be a shelter or to provide accommodation. It is a status symbol. So in a smaller sense, these two buildings are doing something that I think is very interesting. As I said, these are small towns, 11,000, 36,000, both of them about 1,500 people per square kilometer. They are not in Manhattan. They're not in a place that demands density, that demands building up. So what I want to argue is that they are public prototypes of something that we might make sense of as a kind of hedonistic sustainability, an architecture that is arguing we don't need to sacrifice our old behaviors in order to be sustainable, in order to feel good about our damaging effects on the environment. Arguing perhaps that we can continue on the same path of consumption that we've been used to without constraint or limitation to our lifestyles. The skyscraper is a product of modernity, and the Industrial Revolution transformed architecture as well as global relations. Nations in the global north exploited the wealth of colonized lands and enslaved peoples to amass wealth that could then be invested into buildings, lands, and cities. Mure Stornet on the left and Sara Kulturhus are a return to the modernist resolve of the skyscraper. There was a brief and colorful moment of postmodernist movements in architecture, and Rositsa's really lovely paper beforehand shows us at that moment when skyscrapers went POMO. But I would argue that that era represented no real change to the intent or the technology underlying the skyscraper. It was the same materials, the same mathematics, the same calculation, and the same reason to build tall. It's a status symbol that kind of trumps economic rationale. But I want to argue that these buildings are doing something else. The foundation of Norway and Sweden's economic wealth are carbon industries. Norway's famously high standards of living are subsidized by the extraction of North Sea hydrocarbons. And here in Sweden, approximately 70% of our land mass is forested. and the country is the 5th largest exporter of pulp, paper, sawn timber, an industry that employs about 120,000 people in a country of only 10 million. The industrial forestry industry on which Sweden's economic wealth is built is, of course, a colonial and extractive act. And it's a very controversial act that is, on the one side, favored for using clear-cutting techniques like this, where absolutely everything is cut down and pulled out of the ground and then replaced with monocultural forestry. Estimates are somewhat hard to pin down here because it's a very politically charged subject, but some would argue that less than 3% of Sweden's forest surviving today is original natural forest, mixed forest that has never been intervened with by mankind by cutting down. And there's something really interesting about the Sara Kulturhus in Skellefteå that I want to leave you with, which is that it is named after the Swedish author Sara Lidman, who was born in Missentrösk in Skellefteå kommun. Lidman was an author. She spent much of her life in Missentrösk, but she was also a traveler and a political activist. She was an anti-Vietnam War demonstrator and anti-apartheid campaigner. And she wrote about the early industrial exploitation of the northern Swedish forest, the arrival of the railway in northern Sweden, and the commercial extraction of timber in the late 19th and early 20th century is depicted against the environmental and human cultures of the forest. And that's in the Järnbarnen sequence of 7 novels. The 2 wooden skyscrapers are examples of this new trend. And I think it's not a trend towards tall construction, but a trend towards buildings that connect the postmodern sensitivity towards the environmental impact of construction while refusing to give up on the modernist and capitalist dream of the skyscraper. And these buildings are obviously used now as marketing tools by the Swedish and Norwegian forestry industries. They are calling cards for what you can do with timber and why you should use timber instead of concrete and steel. But Sara Kulturhus exposes the contradiction, because it's not just because it's an expensive skyscraper in a city that can't justify it economically, but because by naming it after Sara Lidman, it reveals an intellectual contradiction between 2 conflicting worldviews of the forest. On the one hand, there is a view of wood as a carbon-absorbing material that can replace carbon-emitting steel and concrete. This worldview necessarily regards the industrial clear-cutting of the forest and monocultural replanting of it as a legitimate sacrifice in pursuit of sustainable economic development. On the other hand, by invoking the literature of Sara Lidman, there's this contradictory worldview that regards the wholesale extraction of clear-cutting of the forest as damaging to ecosystems and indigenous communities. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm very sorry I dropped out for a few minutes and missed the ending of Rositsa's presentation. I'm afraid my computer went into meltdown, so hopefully this won't happen again, but thank you for continuing the panel, Greg and Linda. So as not to waste more time, let's move to our third and last but not least speaker, Jenny Eden of Manchester Metropolitan University, with a paper about metamodernism, psychoanalysis, and contemporary painting. Jenny is a painter and a writer, as well as a lecturer in fine art painting. She's currently doing a PhD by practice in painting. Also, she co-runs an art gallery devoted to contemporary painting, and she has exhibited her own work across Europe. Are you ready, Jenny?
Yeah, I'm ready. Can you see me and hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay, I'll just share my screen there. Okay, let's minimize. Okay, here we go. So this is my paper, Metamodernism, Psychoanalysis and Contemporary Painting. Advancing existing research on metamodernism in relation to contemporary painting. This paper examines correlations with psychoanalysis and a cascading oscillatory expansion in the context of my painting practice. Oh, sorry, I'm just trying to, I can't move slides there. Okay. Expanding Timotheus Vermeulen and Robin van den Akker's exploration of painting's oscillatory characteristics in the current milieu, the paper argues metamodernism is inherently psychoanalytic because paintings are embodying complex psychological simultaneities through process and depiction. Going some way to addressing James Elkins's concern with a lack of experimental writing, and because this is the most direct and natural way for me to write, this paper attempts to move between states, oscillating between forms as I do in painting, to develop my thoughts on metamodernism's structure of feeling and its relevance for painting today. To my knowledge, metamodernism has not been significantly discussed in the context of painting. Perhaps painters or critics think it suits other disciplines or it's somehow restrictive. On the contrary, its open-endedness resonates with my practice psychologically, enabling me to recognize patterns and nuances in the work and across the field of contemporary painting. Locating a new romantic sensibility in 2010, Vermeulen and Van den Akker declared, quote, "One can see it in the plethora of works of artists anew, attempting to come to terms with their unconsciousness," end quote. Although only a pocket-sized section of the text, this part sentence supported my belief in a new interest in the psychological underpinnings of art practice and a resurgent relationship between painting and psychology. Here was a nod to the always present unconscious, the invisible elephant in the room, acknowledgement, not disregard, for the maker's psychology and character of being, as a contributing factor in artistic production. To quote Tom van Imschoot and Ritzart Goben, the modern approach is to show painting as an act of reflection, where the painting body makes visible that which the mind is unaware. Indeed, making a painting involves a lineage from the mind down the arm to the hand and fingers and onto a surface, meaning, as well as conscious engagements and interests, painters fold themselves into sequences of marks, structuring being into aesthetic and aesthetic into embodied form. However, the connection between psychoanalysis and metamodernism in painting is not solely based on its containment of the psyche. Metamodernism is inherently psychoanalytic because its oscillatory characteristics provide pulsating simultaneities with the coexistence of complex opposites held together in paintings and in associated experiences of making, thinking, and viewing. Thus, psychoanalytic simultaneity, with its origins in Freud's exploratory pre-psychoanalysis and developed by Melanie Klein, Donald Winnicott, and Julia Kristeva, refers to contradictory thoughts about close relationships, usually an object or mother, held in the mind concurrently. In my painting practice, I embrace irreconcilable and contradictory tensions to enable the work to work, expand, and propel. I imagine coaxing a painting up to a pinnacle, a point with a tiny surface area. One side represents the things in the world I'm working with and against, the other, material concerns and gestural colour. Entering this side and giving too much, the painting risks collapse into self-imposed indulgency. On the other, slippage leads to empty mimesis and a depiction doing nothing psychologically. And so my intention is to bring the painting to the tiny pinnacle slowly, achieving equal measure of both engagements simultaneously, and position it where it is able to look down both sides, but fluctuate there at the top. Painter-writer Amy Silman works from a similar psychoanalytically embodied and metamodern position, and perhaps epitomizes the experimental writing style craved by Elkins. Making a painting, Silman says, is so hard it makes you crazy. You have to negotiate tone, silhouette, line, space, zone, area, layer, scale, speed, and mass, while simultaneously interacting with meaning, thought, sign, text, language, intention, concept, and history. You have to simultaneously predict, diagnose, and ignore the past, present, and future all at once. You have to remember and to forget at once. You have to deny and embrace all your impulses towards romanticism and irony. You have to both love and hate your objects and your subjects, to believe every shred of romantic and passionate myth about painting, and at the same time cast your gimlet eye upon it, end quote. Here, we're far from the interpretative methodologies that plagued painting and psychoanalysis's relationship through the 20th century, and we've entered a new period of coalescence through contemporary painting and metamodernism, reminiscent of the flexible investigations of early Freud. Experiencing a revival since the millennium, painting is also in a unique period of development where the medium's theoretical landscape is widening and there is a renewed interest in its relevance, history, and potential. On one hand, we're in network territory with transitive painting, expanded painting, and the post-medium condition, provisional painting, atemporal painting, post-digital and post-internet painting, all, dare I say it, pretty postmodern sounding to me, or conceptual hangovers at least. But on the other, we've returned to figuration, after a general hiatus since mid-modern abstraction, through a reconsideration of artist labour and presence in the context of art making. This new figuration, semi-figuration, semi-representation is depicting recognizable content, however loose that might be, to address flexible and personal perspectives of being, mirroring our continuous residence as actant movers in this world. In progressive art schools, we're now far from the late 90s, when students like me were lured away by painting's alleged irrelevance to the, inverted commas, freedom of new media and installation. But in becoming more tech, in art as in life, we've simultaneously doubled back into analog processes like painting, getting back on at the neo-expressionist stop we left off, and reconnecting with the likes of Philip Guston and George Baselitz. A new sincerity has arrived for painting with a reinvigorated desire to communicate by hand, going back to the caves, which has reignited the aforementioned relationship between painting and psychology. Figuration is now a variable and idiosyncratic engagement, but it isn't easy. Everyone's an imposter and everyone isn't. We're together alone, to quote Daniel Coupland writing on Nicole Eisenman. Appearing rooted and secure at first glance, slow looking at today's paintings reveals inconsistency and contradiction central to the work. Mirroring the polarized absurdity of our contemporary existence, these oscillations, these intentional contradictions are propelling the medium forward, not in a forward we can predict, but all over, all around, onward and outward, since time is expansive, not linear, and because we don't know where forward is. We're inside a trajectory that's outside itself, but that's exactly where we want to be. Monica Bear's paintings exemplify the kind of sought-after stylistic precariousness or fluctuating indecisiveness present in paintings since the millennium. Irreducible to one recognizable style, her vampire paintings combine a 1940s abstract expressionist background field picture space with hovering kitsch motifs evident of a realist painterly pursuit. A comment on painting's inability to do either style credibly brackets today, the work revels in its mediocrity by performing cliched roles badly. But unlike the neither nor principal Jörg Heiser assigns to Bear's paintings, anachronistically and stylistically, because they do abstraction and they do realism, these paintings speak to a both neither principle in my mind, thus accommodating positions which, by their very presence in the painting, cancel each other out. On recent work, Bear says her motifs, quote, step up, hold their pose and withdraw again into the background, end quote, pushing forward like a thought before settling back as memory images. In Yet to be Titled, an object resembling a peeling silver birch rises behind a semi-transparent wall/platform. The trunk is unreal, but it's convincingly painted. But it's not the full object, it's cropped, and we don't know what happens beyond the stretcher. It sits over a skyish painterly surface, rainbow-coloured like a Helen Frankenthaler soak painting, pulled through with parallel lines. Two parts of a world are sewn together in this painting, but they're also distant and distinct in the colour world they cohabit. This is a serious lampoon where attention to rendering is high and giveaways are deceptively low. Ivan Seal's paintings also depict ambiguous objects and assemblages suspended in depthless colour space, open-ended and nowhere. Flirting with pareidolia and a mute thingliness, we move between registering motifs as form and being sidetracked by the painting's rugged articulation. Reminiscent of Richard Volheim's two-foldedness, where the depicted subject and the manner of the depiction occupy the same period of looking, Seal's paintings embody a truth to materials and a still life parody, moving one inside the other like a child's toy. Through idiosyncratic systems of naming, they also balance literary understanding with chaos words, locating commingled semi-states suggestive of the familiar elsewhere, the everyday weird. Allowing painting and language to feed off each other in oscillation, Seal's titles not only echo peculiar characteristics in his paintings, they open new interpretative and psychological structures. My own figuration is a semi-authentic comment on reality objects, stripped back and minimalized like Baudrillard's total simulacrum, where the original is replaced by a lesser representation, rendering the thing muted and smoothed with missing parts. My paintings personify the insubstantiality of thoughts, feelings, and memories, where the central figure is unfolding in space, quietly wrestling with its positions, giving the illusion of propelling forward, yet unequivocally still. Oscillating between object and non-object, and registering as both one painted form and two sides of painted space, my paintings not only imbue their potential for simultaneity, they visualize a state akin to Henry Bergson's everlasting time, where real form never comes to fruition and the painting is arrested in forever becoming. German painter Markus Lepertz, still working today, invented a device to disrupt singular readings of the objects he painted. The dithyramb took his paintings into parallel existences through the act of painting and through quasi-nonsense naming. Real but not real things, the recognizable subject closest to Lepertz's depiction was liberated, allowing the painting to enter other territory and be freed from obvious interpretations of meaning. Like Markus Lepertz's dithyramb, I've invented a metaphor for painting, which also critiques metamodernism's query simplistic binary position, claiming that in reality, in the paintings we make like the lives we encounter, including our own, each side of an oppositional dualism generates further complexity, cascading down from an original position. Taking inspiration from painter Per Kirkeby's writing, which embraces a poetic earth science perspective, my shower principle is a dream, an imaginary scenario inside which my paintings operate. In this cascading oscillatory expansion, the sides of the opposition disperse into a complex arrangement of opposites in a never-ending glistening snow maze, an endless cycle of falling and scattering, flakes rejoining at the top when they get to the bottom. A diagram, a snapshot of the fall. I don't witness this recurring scenario, but I know it's happening behind thought and disappearing deep into the ether. In the vastness of these snowballing multiples, a richness of opposition occurs. The sincerity, irony, equivalence, the original binary parts have not only scattered into multi-parts, their opposite partner is somewhere in the field. Of course, it's difficult to tell one part side from the other, but that's the beauty of it. The opposition is there, but not pronounced, unclear to the naked eye, but subtly embedded in the disbursement, appearing as a mass of scintillating fragments. A painting operates through the shift in the bounce between one part side and its partner, whispering and weaving across other multi-parts. Not to be confused with the postmodern non-committal in between, the shower principle is utterly dependent on its part sides. With activity occurring so fast, fluctuation, friction is maintained. A postmodern reenactment and modernist transparency, this so psychoanalytically affiliated binary can be felt through the multipolar conversations. Less depthy than Vermeulen's metamodern depthiness, today's paintings flatten out on closer inspection, leaving collected marks to carry through meanings and projecting depth back to the viewer to contain. This is the paradox of our time, part authentic, part superficial, with a desire to be everything and nothing forever concurrently. Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you very much, Jenny, and of course also Rositsa and James for making this a pretty coherent panel, I'd say. So let's open the Q&A. I'd say we have about 10 minutes perhaps, because we also started later with the panel. Are there any questions for one of the three speakers, either in the room in Seattle or perhaps here on Zoom? I don't see any questions in the chat just yet.
Can I ask a question, Dennis?
Ah, hello, Anthony.
Hello there. It's a question really for Rositsa and James. Could you just say a bit more about how metamodernism is a contested term, or whether it's contested at all within architecture and urban design? Because it seemed to be something that was relatively settled in Rositsa's paper that's to do with sustainability, public facing, use of natural materials, development of old buildings in relation to the Neues Museum. But James, you didn't use the term that much, and you were saying, for example, that the idea of buildings and sustainability was actually a postmodern aspect. Just to kind of help me out with somebody who's coming from a different discipline to think about modernism, postmodernism, metamodernism in architecture and urban design. For example, I'm always having arguments with architects and designers about Daniel Libeskind's work. From a literary perspective, it seems postmodernist. Other architects have said it's postmodernist and the resistance to the right angle, for example, and yet other architects will tell me that actually it's straightforwardly modernist. So can you help me out?
I'm sorry, but I'm not quite sure that I understood your question, because I have an issue with hearing you. Dennis or somebody else, could you please repeat on the microphone, because there is an echo.
Well, it was a question for you, all you three, I think. So did Jenny hear it?
Yes, I did. I think it was an architectural based question though for the others.
I'll step in. I think that there is still some way to go to have a really broad body of literature about what metamodernism might mean for architecture. I teach architectural history in my sort of day job, and the majority of what has been discussed and written about architecture tends to divide the 20th century into this pre and post moment between modernism and postmodernism, and it often descends into a stylistic differentiation, which is not so good. And I think what Rositsa's paper was doing, certainly what I liked about Rositsa's discussion and analysis of those buildings, and what I think I'm trying to get to in my paper, wherever it might be going, is that buildings have intentions which cannot be summed up in their aesthetics, or cannot be categorized by their aesthetics. And I think the Neues Museum in Berlin is a fantastic example of a building that doesn't fit either of those categories, I would say. But I think Rositsa's argument made that really enriching.
I think that in architecture, I think architects are really frightened after the last isms, after postmodernism, after deconstructivism, frightened from this stylistic shift too much in style. And therefore, I think we're all afraid of saying that what we are doing is metamodern architecture. Though I think really much of today's really good architecture is metamodern. There is really a shift towards the building as an object, as a physical body with its presence. So it's not so much about meaning, it's not so much about architecture as language, as text, but as a physical object that is there and it has its qualities. So I think that's a really important shift from postmodernism to what we are seeing since the millennium and before that.
Thank you. Jenny, as the painter of the three, I guess your paper actually explicitly addressed Anthony's question. Would you agree?
Anthony's question.
Well, was about architecture. Also, your paper is very much about how your work also engages with the writing about metamodernism.
Yeah.
To be in a kind of dialogue with the theorization of metamodernism.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think probably to talk about that, I can also answer Timothy Brown's question
in the chat,
because I'm probably going to say similar things to both. But I think Timothy's just mentioned there about other visual arts. I mean, I work across. I don't really work across fine art. I work only in painting, really. So I'm not a specialist across other visual arts. But I can't see any reason why the goals can't be the same for other parts of fine art or visual arts. But I just want to say that metamodernism really isn't a goal for my painting. It's something that, and to speak to Anthony's point as well, it's something that's come through the practice of making paintings and realizing in the last kind of 10 years or so that the paintings that I was making and the paintings that I'm seeing around me are not evident of the kind of postmodern painting that I kind of went to uni with, let's say. So it's not a goal, it's more of a kind of observation. But the point here about Isabel Graw's The Value of Painting, where she's kind of talking about the medium of painting having a voice and being able to direct its own future, which is what the Value of Painting, the book that I put on the slides is about. Yes, I think there's a kind of anthropomorphic quality that painting is taking on at the moment. That's also something I'm in my research, where the painting is kind of a new materialist object. It has a quality of being able to communicate what it needs. So yes, I don't know if I've in an almost human way. But I mean, I don't see why other visual arts can't do that. But I do feel that a painting is a relationship with a human. So it's a human and other relationship. There's a kind of facing each other in some kind of dialogue. So in that sense, the painting in front of you becomes anthropomorphic and takes on a kind of human-like quality. That maybe, I mean, I'm maybe biased, maybe I feel that painting has a special quality to do that, but I think we know from sculpture and minimalist sculpture that has had a kind of rich history of thinking about anthropomorphism as well. Anyway. Okay,
thank you. And thank you from Timothy in the chat too. Rositsa, you're also an architect, so in that sense you're let's say a metamodernist yourself, while you're also familiar with metamodern theory between quotation marks perhaps. How does your familiarity with the theorization have affected your work as an architect?
I would say it's vice versa, because I came to that concept of metamodernism, to the essay of Tim and Robin some years ago, and it was like sort of a revelation for me, because somebody else was describing what we were trying to describe in our work. So we've been working in this without, of course, we were not modern and we were not postmodern. Actually, we didn't know exactly what we were. if you have to be some ism. But when I read the essay and then this Luke Turner's manifesto, it was really very, very, very special to me, because it was entirely related to what we were doing, and we were trying to explain, not so nicely at that time. So theory came like explaining our practice.
Okay, thank you very much. Is there a final question, perhaps from the Seattle room? Because I see you've unmuted yourself. Is there a question?
I think we're about ready to wrap up this panel. I think we're set here.
You have to move on to the next panel.
Yes, we'll have about a 15-minute break and then be back for the final panel at 12:45.
Okay, let's conclude this particular panel here then. Thank you very much again, also for answering the questions in the Q&A. I hope you all have a great afternoon. Here it's getting dark already in the Netherlands, so off to another coffee, I'd say, and have a great remainder of your summit.
Thank you very much.